Hey everyone, it's ArtDude47 and I'm back with another video on my game development journey. Today I'm excited to introduce you to my new project. It's a 2D dating simulator game that's inspired by Tokimeki Memorial. Some of you may be familiar with the action button review of Tokimeki Memorial. This actually got me pretty interested in the game and interested in programming a similar game. So for those of you that don't know, Tokimeki Memorial is a Japanese franchise, and it's a dating simulator that's done by Konami. And so basically the way it works is it takes place in a Japanese high school, and you go to school, raise your stats, and you date people. And I thought that'd be an interesting game genre to tackle, because it doesn't seem overly difficult to develop, and so it might be interesting to tackle and try to create a full game based around that. With that being said, in this devlog I'll be taking you through the process of developing the game, starting with the dialogue system today. So I'll show you a behind the scene look at design choices I've made and the challenges I've faced, as well as the progress I'm making. I'm really excited to share this journey with you and give you a peek in the world of my game development. And so I'm hoping I'll be able to add some valuable information as well, and really show you every step of the way. And so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get into some of the content surrounding the video. Alright, so like I said, the first thing I want to tackle is the dialogue system in the game. And so we are just going to quickly, I'm going to write down what needs to exist. So we've got the dialogue system. And it's going to need probably a dialogue scriptable option is how scriptable object, is how I'm going to do it in Unity. So we'll call it dialogue SO, and that will have the speaker name, the text of the actual dialogue itself, an icon, so that way each different dialogue line can have a different picture of the person who's speaking it, to kind of, make it feel more alive. And then we're going to need a list of responses. So basically, if the player can respond to the dialogue, it'll be a list of the options that the player's given, and then the next dialogue. And this next dialogue will be used if there's no responses for the player. If it's just going to go straight into a different dialogue, then it will just have the next dialogue, and once the first one is finished, it'll automatically play into that second one. So then the system itself will need a couple of functions. It'll need the start dialogue, which will take a dialogue, if I could spell. That'll take the dialogue and display it to the UI. And then there will need to be a show options, which will loop through the options and display them all. Then we will need a select option, which will display the next dialogue And then we'll need some kind of function to end the dialogue. My writing's getting a little sloppy here, but that will hide the UI most likely. And so I think that's at least a pretty good high-level breakdown of what we're going to need in the dialogue system. So the next thing I'm going to want to do is I am going to hop into Unity, and I've actually already set up a little basic UI, so I'm just going to walk you through that real quick, what I've got. Alright, so I've got a dialogue UI here, which is just the canvas itself, and then I've got the dialogue background, which is a panel that's invisible. Then I have the icon, which I have shut off because not all dialogues will have a speaker icon. So the dialogue system will need to detect that, and if it has a speaker, it'll turn it on. If it doesn't, it'll stay off. Next, I've got the dialogue text background, which then also contains the dialogue text. And for this, I'm using TextMesh Pro, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit later, why I've chosen TextMesh Pro, but for now, that is what we're using. So then we've got the name background, which also won't always be required, so that can be turned off. That's why it's kind of this separate option, because if there's like a narration, for example, like, I don't know, you arrived at school, something like that, that's not being spoken by another character, then there won't be a name. And that, of course, has the text option as well. And then there's the response box, which is hidden by default, but when responses are displayed, that's where they'll go. And that's all I've got so far, so next we'll go ahead and get into the coding portion. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do here is go ahead and create a scripts folder. So I'm just doing that now. And then we're going to get right into creating another folder. This will be for the dialogue system. So then from here we want to go ahead and make a C# script, and this is actually going to be for my dialogue scriptable object. Once we get that opened up, we can delete everything that comes there because it's going to be a scriptable object, and so remove mono behavior and make it a scriptable object. Now, as we briefly spoke about, there's a few variables we're going to need. So first is a string for the speaker name, and then I'm going to go ahead and create a text area just to make it look a little bigger in the inspector. If you don't know what this does, I'll show you in a minute. And so we'll make a string for the actual dialogue text itself. And then we're going to need a sprite for the icon. Now we're going to make a list for the responses, like I was saying, and I'm just deciding here how I want to do that. And I think what I decided we're going to do is we're going to make a separate class for the options, and we're going to call it option. And we're going to make it serializable, so that way you can still edit it in the editor. And make that option class. The reason I'm doing a class is because it needs a string of what the option text actually is, but then it also needs to take a dialogue scriptable option, a scriptable object of what the next dialogue will be if that option's selected. Just realized made a mistake here where we need to go ahead and make sure both say that it's a list of options. And then we also need to go ahead and add this create asset menu, so that way we can create new scriptable objects from within the Unity editor. So we'll go ahead and do that here. We'll just say it's new dialog. And we'll make a menu name of dialog system.dialog or /dialog. Going back into Unity after it compiles, we're going to go ahead and create another new folder. This will be for our dialog scriptable objects, and then you can see we go to create dialog system dialog. You see the speaker name, and you see the text area is bigger for the text. That's what that text area field was. And so we can create that dialog, select a sprite to represent it, and then you can create a list of options as well. And as you can see, the options have the option text field, as well as a reference to the next dialog, the dialog that that particular option would lead to. Alright, so from here we're going to go ahead and want to create another C# script. This one is going to be the actual dialog system itself. This will be how we handle displaying the dialog to the UI. So we can go ahead and get rid of those starting methods. We're not going to use them. We are going to go ahead and import UI and TextMesh Pro so we can use both of those. And then I'm going to use the header tag here. This will just create a header called UI elements in the editor window. So you'll see that in a minute. And then for the UI elements, we're going to want to have a reference to the dialog background. We're going to want a reference as well to the name background. Then we need a reference to the option background. And then the other one we're going to do is an option button prefab. So that way we can instantiate buttons when we need to. And then we're just going to do a couple other references here. TextMesh Pros for the name text as well as the dialog text, and an image for the speaker image. So once that's done, we'll make a queue of dialog scriptable objects, and we'll just call it the dialog queue. And we'll make a reference to the current dialog. And here I'm just thinking about exactly how I'm going to have the dialog system working. And I'm actually deciding against using the queue method. That would work for a dialog system, but I just don't think it's perfect here for what I'm trying to do. So instead, we'll just keep the reference to the current dialog. I'm going to do another header here and just put audio. I don't currently have any audio assets. But I'm just setting it up for if I do. And basically the audio I'm looking for here would be like a typewriter sound to play while the dialogue is being typed out to the player. Now we're going to go ahead and make the first method we're going to need here, which would be the start dialog. It's going to take a dialog scriptable object, and it's going to set the current dialog to that scriptable object. From here, we're going to want to do a check to see if there is a name included with the dialog scriptable object. So we'll just see current dialogue dot speaker name, and if it's not empty, then we're going to go ahead and update the name, background, and text. Otherwise, if it is empty, we just want to disable the name background so that it doesn't appear there. Now we're going to want to do the same thing here with the speaker icon. So basically the same exact code. We're going to see if the icon is null or if it's not null, and if it isn't, then we'll go ahead and display the image and make sure to set it to active as well. And then of course if it is null, there is no image, so we'll just set the background inactive so there's not a white box appearing there with the dialogue, of course. Alright, now we're going to start getting into it. So what we're going to do here is use a coroutine in order to produce the typewriter effect. So I'll go ahead and call start coroutine, and then I'm going to call it type dialogue. That's going to take the current dialogue, the actual text of the dialogue. Then we'll go ahead and make that type dialogue method so that way I do not get the error that we're getting here. So it's enumerator for a coroutine, type dialogue, and it's going to need to take a string. And then for something like this, basically what we're going to do is loop through every character of the string. So for each, and we'll just do char letter in the dialogue string. And as we loop through, we're going to add that letter to the text. And I'm leaving myself a note here to do, this is where the typing sound will also get played if I had one. I decided rather than to do it as a to-do, I'll just check if it's null, and if it's not, it'll play that sound. That way I don't have to remember to take out that comment and replace it with actual code. So if it's not equal to null, it'll just play the typing sound. And now here's why we're using a coroutine. We can do the yield return new wait for seconds, and that will repeat based on an amount of time. What I need to do here is actually make a variable for how long it takes. And so I'm using editor tags again. We'll add another header here. And I wasn't real sure what to call it, so I called it variables for now, which isn't the best descriptive name, but we'll just call it typing speed. And I'm setting it to 0.1f. It's a float, and that way it'll appear in the editor, and we can adjust that to change the typing speed as we want. So basically though, that is going to wait 0.1 seconds, and then it's going to add the next letter, and it's going to go so on until the whole dialogue is typed out. That's why the yield return new is within the for loop. And so I'm going to use a temporary dialog scriptable object just to test that the dialog system's working. That's why I put remember to delete, just a note to myself that this variable won't be needed in the final version of the dialog system. And so we're going to use Unity's built-in start method, which we'll call right when it loads, and we're going to start the test dialog. Go ahead and save the script and head back into Unity once it compiles. And I'm going to attach it here to my dialog UI. So as you can see, we've got that. And now I'm just going to fill in all of these UI elements with the ones I already created. So the dialog background will be the dialog background. I named all of them to match, so that way it kind of makes more sense. And so I'm just filling all of those in so that way everything displays properly. As I said, I don't have the audio yet, so we'll leave that blank. We accounted for that. And then we'll fill it in with that test dialog we created a moment ago. And if we run the program, we're getting an error. It's because I'm trying to get component game object from the speaker icon, the image here, and that doesn't work. It doesn't have that component. What I should have done is speaker icon dot game object dot set active rather than get component game object. So we're correcting that here, and I need to do it in both spots, and then it should work. So we'll let it recompile here. And now when I hit play, it does type out. It prints the image we selected. It's got test as the name. This is a test dialog. So then we're just going to want to further test here. So I will remove the name. And when it loads and we play, the name box is no longer displayed, so that's working properly. Next, we want to go ahead and remove the image as well. And now just the text box itself displays. The image is no longer there, so that's all working correctly. I'm going to set the background of the main camera to black just because I prefer that over the default blue. And now we're going to get back into our script and continue working here. So next thing we need to work on is displaying the response options to the player. And so we'll just check if the current dialog.options.count is greater than 0. That means there should be responses, and so we need to display them. We're going to make a method for that, so we'll call it display options. And so I'm realizing here if there are no options and it needs to play a next dialog, I don't have a variable in place. So we'll go ahead and set that up now. This is for a dialog that just moves on to the next one. It doesn't have player response options. And so that will be a reference to another dialog scriptable object, and we'll just call it next dialog. I'm also just going to put a note to myself in the header that it should be one or the other. There should either be options or a next dialog, not both. This isn't the prettiest way around this, but it should just be a note to remind myself and make sure that I don't accidentally populate both fields on the same dialog. With that done, we can hop back in and then check if there's a next dialog. And so if that's not null, then we would just call our start dialog method again and pass that next dialog. And I'm just trying to comment and kind of keep that updated, so that way I know if I have to step away from the project for a while, I'll be able to read my comments and kind of see where I was going. Also, if you hear snoring in the background, I'm very sorry. That's actually my dog. She's sleeping under my feet right now. Alright, so if there's no options but there is a follow-up, what we're going to do, we're going to wait for player input. So that's going to be a coroutine as well, which I'll call wait for input. And then finally, if there's no options and no follow-up dialog, we're going to end the dialog. So for now, I'm just going to go ahead and debug.log, no additional dialog, so that way we can see that. So there's two methods here that we've named that we need to go ahead and create. First, we've got this display options. And what we're going to want to do here is make sure the options panel or the background is set to active. And then we need to loop through all of the options and create a button for each one that there is. And since we made a script or a prefab for the button, or at least we're referencing one in code, we can just instantiate that prefab. So we'll do the option button prefab. And we're going to make it a child of the option background. And that actually needs to be .transform since it's going to be a child. And then we need to set the option button's text, so that way it actually displays what the correct option is. So we're going to get component in children, and we're looking for the Text Mesh Pro, because the buttons also will use Text Mesh Pro, and then we'll set the text to the corresponding option text. We also want to get the button itself, so that way we can set up what's going to happen when the button gets clicked. We're going to add a listener, and if the button gets clicked, we're going to create a delegate that will call the method choose_option. This is another method that we'll need to create. This isn't like a default method, so we'll need to handle the choose_option. And I'm just trying to think of what parameters we need to give that option. And what we'll do is the next dialog from whichever one was selected. So whichever option was selected, we will pass the next dialog. Alright, so let's go ahead and tackle the next method here. We will do the choose_option method. And that's going to go ahead and take in a dialog scriptable object. We'll just call it dialog. And the reason we made a separate method is because it's going to need to do a few things more than just start the next dialog. We also need to delete all the option buttons. So I'm going to make a method for that. And then we'll start the dialog as well. And we'll just make the method. The reason I'm pushing this out into a method too is in case a case ever comes up where we may need to clear the buttons even without clicking on one. That way we can just call a method. It's always easier to do it that way. So we'll reference the transform this time because we're going to be destroying them. And so we just loop through each button, destroy it, and then we'll set the options background to false as well, so that way it goes away. And then we need this coroutine that we created, wait for input. Because this option, if there is a next dialog, we don't want it to display unless the player presses a button indicating they're ready to see the next dialog. So right here, we'll go ahead and do this, but it's not private, it's an IEnumerator since it is a coroutine. Called it wait for input, and this time we're going to go ahead and do our yield return. And this is going to be a new wait until. And it's going to wait until we get input.get mouse down 0. So basically I'm just setting the key to be the left mouse click, and then it'll start the next dialog. And we'll come back and correct this later because obviously we shouldn't probably hard code controls, but we'll correct that in a moment here. Realized I had a parenthesis wrong there, so I just corrected that. And now if we save this code, we should be ready to go ahead and test it and make sure that responses are working. I'm getting an error message here. Looks like it was array index out of bounds. And it's because we don't have a prefab for the button. So we're going to set that up now. And I'm just going to take the button that I already had and just create a prefab out of that. And then we'll delete all the buttons out of there since we'll be instantiating the buttons. Going to go ahead and set the button prefab reference so that way it's got that reference, because that's where the null error was coming from. It was trying to create buttons, but we hadn't created that reference. So now when we run it, this is a test dialog, displays yes or no. So it is displaying those. Now nothing's happening currently, or we're getting an error when we click it. That's just because there's no next dialog set yet. So I'm going to create this bool is typing, although it does end up that I don't need this, so I later end up removing it. But I don't think I captured footage of that. So I'm creating this here to try to fix an issue what's going on, which is that the dialogues are all, or the options are all displaying at the same time as the dialogue, and I want to wait for it to be done typing. So I'm checking is typing true in the type dialog method. And then I'm going to set it to false after the method. So now once the whole thing is done typing, then is typing will be false. And now this is where I'm going to call display options. That way the options don't get displayed until the whole message is typed out. So now since we did it that way, we have to check if there aren't any options in the current dialog. If there's no options, we're going to check for a next dialog. And if that exists, then we're just going to display the next dialog. And we'll just do that by calling start dialog on the new dialog. If there is no dialog, then we just need to end the dialog. So for now, I'll just have it log, no more dialog. And then finally, we just need to return out of this method. And then if there are options, it won't go through and return, and so it'll just do the method that we already created to display the options. And actually we need to change this to wait for input because we don't want to display the next dialog until there's been the player input. So now if we run this, you can see it types out the dialog and then the options buttons appear after the dialog's been typed out. So now I'm going to create another new dialog just so we can test the response system. So I'm going to give some follow-ups to the responses. We'll give them some text. This one will just say you just clicked yes. So that way we can track that the player can click on the yes. And then we'll make the other one indicate that the player chose no. And I'm going to give this one an image just to test that. And so you see we can just drag and drop them into the appropriate slots. And then it should just work. So we'll go ahead and run the program. Types out this is a test dialog. You can see the yes name pops up. You just clicked yes. And we got the output in the console, no more dialog. I'm going to just pop the no dialog as the next dialog for the yes response just so you can see that working as well. This is a test dialog, yes. You just clicked yes, and then if I click, it should also say you just clicked no. And then the no more dialog comes up after it plays that. So that's all working as intended. So now we're going to go back into the code. We need to actually do something when dialog's over. So I'm realizing here that no matter what happens next, if it's going to display a new dialog or the options, we want to wait for input. And so I'm going to move that text down here so that way it waits for the input first before it checks if the next dialog is null or not equal to null. Then it's going to start the next dialog. Otherwise, then we'll say end of dialogue. And that should just make it so that way the system is never automatically showing the next dialogue. It always waits for player input before the next dialogue's displayed. And now it's working properly. It's not ending the dialogue until after I click, where before it was manually or automatically saying end of dialogue reached. So now that that's working, we can make a method to actually handle the end of the dialogue. If we didn't wait for input, this method would hide the UI before the player actually got a chance to read the last page of the dialogue. We're going to want to make sure to set the dialogue background to true during the start dialogue, since we're going to turn it off in end dialogue. So set the background to false at the end of the dialogue. We're also just going to make sure that current dialogue is set to null. And we're going to clear out all of the UI as well. I was forgetting what I named the image, but there it is, speaker icon. We'll set the sprite to null as well. And I realized that I forgot to actually call end dialog, so we'll replace that debug.log with the end dialog call. And now if we play the program once more, we should get this as a test dialog. It'll give us our options. You just clicked yes. You just clicked no. And then everything turns off when it's over. And we'll just run the system one more time here. This is a test dialog, just to click the no button to make sure it's working. And it was working as intended, since I hadn't tested the second button yet. So back in the code here, there is something else that I want to tackle. And it's basically, what if the player wants to skip the typewriter effect and just wants the dialogue to display? So here, we're just going to make a bool, skip, and we're going to set it to false. And then I'm going to check for player input. The same mouse button that moves the dialogue forward. And we're going to skip the dialogue by setting skipping to true. And now we'll just do an if statement. If skip typing, which means the player wants to skip the typing. We will basically just display the whole dialogue text at once, and then we'll break out of this loop. So now, if we go back into Unity, compile our code, I'm just going to make this dialogue a bit longer so that way we can see it working and make sure it's working properly. So now, as it's typing out, when I click, and nothing's happening, so something's not working right here. And I'm just trying to figure out what's going on. Checking to make sure I actually saved the changes to the code. And so now I'm just going to keep clicking and see if it works at all during any of the frames. And it doesn't look like it is, so there's something going on that's causing this not to work as I intended it to. Looking at the code again here. I'm just going to throw in a debug.log to see if it ever gets called. That way I can see if the system's detecting the mouse click. It should at least do the debug.log. If it's not getting detected at all, then I can troubleshoot a bit further. And as you can see, there's no output to our console, so it's never even detecting that I'm clicking the mouse. Here I'm just trying anything. I'm not real sure why I changed it to get mouse button to check if that would work. But as you can see, it's still not working. So we jump back into the code here. And I'm just looking, trying to figure out what's going on. And I finally spotted it. Basically, since I'm in a for loop the whole time, I need to check for input at every frame of the loop. So every time it loops through, it'll be checking for that mouse input in order to actually skip the dialogue. Now it should work properly. We'll go ahead and run the program once more. And as you can see, when I click, it does skip the dialogue and display your options right away. Now there's the slight problem that with a long dialogue, the option box covers it. So I'll just move it above our dialog box. And now everything's looking good. You can skip the typewriter if you don't like that, if you want to see what the next dialogue is quicker. And that kind of just gives more options to the player, you know, if they don't want to sit through a long dialogue being typed out. That being said, we still may tweak the dialogue typing speed in the end. We may also add an option to allow the player to change what the typing speed is. So, you know, this one's not set in stone. And so now I'm just adding my comment back in to explain what this is doing. And really, this is a good stopping point. I think this is everything I wanted the dialogue system to do, at least for now. So I'd say we are good and done with the dialogue system for now. Hi, this is future editor art dude. I've been working a little bit more on a tool to use in editor that I wanted to show you guys. I don't think I want to go through how I created it exactly because it was new for me and pretty difficult, but it's a dialogue editor. So you see I open the window here, and it's a node-based editor that just makes me a little easier to create dialogue. So I can create two different kinds of dialogue node here. One that has no options and one that has options. And you'll see that it created a scriptable object, gave it a unique name, and now I can rename it. And you can see the attached scriptable object gets renamed with it. And now also this isn't the prettiest implementation and there's still some glitches, but it works fairly well. So I'm realizing this is the speaker name, so I just changed it to testing. And then the actual dialogue itself, I'm just putting a little dialogue in here so we can test out and show you how it works. But there's a spot for the name, the dialogue, and the icon, as well as options. So you add the option. And you can see we get new option. So you can name them. That will be the actual option test, or the option text, excuse me. And then if I add another node, this one takes no option, so you'll see there's no add option button, and there's no output for that option. We'll just call this test no, and we'll change it to no. And we'll just do the you clicked on no. But this time I can actually take the new option 2, drag it into there, and now the scriptable objects have updated themselves so that way it knows to go to that dialogue. And then we'll make one for yes. You'll see if after I rename it I have to delete the options that are currently on the node. It's a glitch that I still haven't figured out yet, but it's working well enough. We're also going to give this one an image just to test out. And we'll drag the yes option into this dialogue. That's what I'm talking about there. I deleted it before I added 2 new ones. It's just a glitch I haven't worked out yet. You have to delete the first one because it doesn't get added properly. And we'll just make a final dialogue to go to. Say okay, all done. We'll drag both options there. It's also finicky on where you can grab it to move. But then if I close out, you can see the scriptable object is populated. And so I'll go ahead and pop it into our dialogue system as the test dialogue. And if we play it, it's going to take a second to load for some reason. While it's loading, I'll just let you know, I didn't think I would go over this in depth just because I struggled a lot with it. I'm not used to making editor tools, but you can see it's a test to make sure it's working. Yes, you clicked on yes. Then there's new option 1 and 2 since we didn't rename them. Okay, all done. And so it just makes it a bit quicker to edit dialogues, create new dialogues, and visualize the actual dialogue tree itself. So I just created that tool to kind of help me with it. Again, I might be able to go into detail if that's something people want, but otherwise I think I will just leave it as it is, and we'll just move on with the coding of the game itself. Alright guys, I think that's going to be it for this one. Thank you for sticking through. Please, if you would, like the video and subscribe, and let me know what you think. I tried a few new things this time around. I actually did a voiceover after the fact, after I coded, so that way I wasn't, stumbling through my words as much while I was trying to think about the code. I could just explain to you what I was doing after the fact. Let me know if you like that or if I should just voice over live. And if you have any questions about the project or the code itself, feel free to ask those in the comments as well. Until next time, thank you for watching.